Hi, everybody. We've got an exciting interview for you guys here today. I'm Nick Palmer, along my fellow 5-on-3 hockey co-host, Samantha Bohrer, and today I would love to welcome Joe Buono, who obviously spearheads the Isles Fix newsletter and the Twitter account, which is one of my go-to sources for my Islanders updates. But even more than that, he returns to the airwaves for his alma mater here at WFUV Sports. And even more than that, he just released a book. That's right, it is titled New York Islanders A to Z. You can go on their Twitter or on BookBaby to get your copy for any young Islanders fan that may be in your life.
What's going on,
Absolutely.
guys? Nice to meet you guys, Samantha and Nick. Appreciate the opportunity to talk to you.
Nice to meet you. We were just talking about our Twitters, and I know that, like you said, you follow me and I follow you right back on Twitter, which is really exciting to now finally be able to converse semi face to face, I suppose we'll call it via Zoom, for lack of a better term.
No, it's wonderful. Yeah, and it's I actually texted Bob Aarons, my old executive producer, when the book came out, and I told him all those broadcasting lessons, and what gets me back on the air is writing a book.
Yeah, of course, it always happens in the funniest ways, but I love it, and thank you for being here. And on the topic of the book, it must have been quite an undertaking to make this whole thing happen. And it took a while, and it comes at a really crucial time for the Islanders. It's their 50th anniversary, but they've also recently moved into the brand new big and beautiful UBS, which you've honored as the letter U in your
Yes,
A to Z
they were very happy
Islanders
about
book.
that.
I'm so sure. So I guess as we see, this whole new generation of Islanders fans emerging and coming up in this new era, was the timing for this book kind of intentional with everything that's been happening in the franchise recently, or what were you just hoping to get out
Yeah,
of now, right when this book dropped?
sure. So in 2018, I became a dad to my daughter Annalisa, and as parents will find out, and maybe you guys will one day find out, is that you start to have a lot of children's and kids' books lying around. And I started thinking about just different ways to connect with your kids. And obviously, being a huge sports fan, I was thinking about how could you connect with your young kids, through sports. And there were a number of different types of A to Z books, but there wasn't one specifically done for the New York Islanders. And given what I've done in social media with my podcast and Twitter, I had a fan base there that I knew I could connect with if I got the right product out. So this idea of creating an A to Z children's book that can double up as a picture book, but also a primer for the kind of younger generation that's really starting to become a diehard when you're 10, 11, 12 years old and so forth, popped in my head. I knew I needed a great illustrator, and I knew a gentleman named Joe Morasic, who luckily also was a big Islanders fan, and to be able to share in the passion of the subject made this whole thing a lot easier. So in 2008, we started putting the thoughts process together. A for Arbor, B for Bossy. Those were quite easy. G for Gillies, P for Potvin. We had to get some creative on some of the other letters. And then about 6 months into it, I said, you know what? I better ask the Islanders to see if they're okay with this, just because we're drawing logos and team colors and all that. And luckily enough, they were on board with that. They gave us intellectual property. They just wanted to make sure that a portion of the proceeds went to the Children's Foundation, and that they got final sign off, which we were perfectly okay with. So that was 4 years ago. And then finally in January, we got the okay. And in February, the book came out.
I love that. And you just kind of touched on it. It's for a 50-year span, you have to create quite a bit of variety in this book. And that's what it seems to be intended to do. But I feel like you could have easily fallen into a trap of making it a very dynasty-oriented book. So how did you maybe avoid doing that? And maybe what did you go for maybe some unconventional picks for your letters?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So, obviously we had the guys that were going to have the retired numbers, and they were always going to be in the book and be prominent. After a while, I realized that the Islanders have a Hall of Fame, which actually is much more prominent now at UBS Arena than it was previously. That was always kind of a dormant thing, that they had a banner up there, but not a lot of attention was played to it. And we wanted to make sure that we have an every Islanders Hall of Fame era player on there as well. And just by doing that, it introduced a requirement to talk about certain other eras. So like Kenny Johnson, for instance, a great defenseman in the late 90s and early 2000s. Patrick Flatley, who was a captain during the 92-93 team, was there. We were able to then make sure we brought in Eddie Westfall, who was the team's first captain, and some others. And then it also led to some challenges and answers related to some of the letters, in that the letter Q was going to be always a real challenge. And when you look at the Islanders' historical database and players that ended in the letter Q, the one that was most prominent was a player named Alan Quine. Now, Alan Quine scored one of the bigger goals in Islanders' recent history, which was a double overtime Game 5 winner in the 2016 quarterfinals against the Florida Panthers, which was the first playoff series the Islanders had won in 23 years. So Alan Quine, we had a drawing. I wrote a whole thing about him, and he was going to be in the book. And then as the book kind of neared completion, he just stuck out so much compared to the other names that were in there. No offense to Alan Quine and his 3-4-year NHL career. So Bob Bourne is an Islander Hall of Famer who is known for his speed. So we just changed Q to the word quick, and that allowed us to get Bobby Bourne in there, who's an Islanders Hall of Famer and a 4-time Stanley Cup winner. Another story around some of the letters that were challenging was the letter T, because there were just so many candidates. We had Brian Trottier, we had John Tonelli, we had Bill Torrey, and then we also had John Tavares, who maybe some wanted in the book and maybe others did not. He is not in there. And the way we got around that is by bringing in trophy winners. Brian Trottier is the only Islander to win the Hart Trophy, so we're able to make him the letter H for Hart. We were able to use the letter D for dynasty to talk about Bill Torrey as the architect of that dynasty that built that, one of the best North American dynasties of all time. And then for letter T, we're able to use John Tonelli for that instead.
I love that. Yeah, I can only really imagine when you get to certain letters and you're like, well, I am fresh out of ideas here.
Right.
It gets a little difficult.
You talked about, and Samantha, we talked about the letter U, and the letter U was UBS Arena, right? But when we first started writing the book, that had not happened yet. They hadn't even broken ground. So U was uniforms, it was going to be. And we ended up swapping that out and moving that to J for jerseys. And then the team was like, hey, can you make U for UBS Arena? And it's one of the more amazing photos on there. If you look at the article that the New York Islanders posted, there's a time-lapse video that the illustrator did. And it probably took him as long as anything that's in the book, which was a complete illustration of UBS Arena on its first game, which was November 2020, 2021 against the Calgary Flames. So the book went through a lot of changes just because of the amount of years that it took to do. I mean, X's and O's was going to be Barry Trotz, and he's no longer the head coach. We went to something more generic for there. And then guys like John Tonelli and Butch Goring got their numbers retired in 2020. That was originally not what I had written, but we had to make sure we added on. The Islanders went to the conference finals in back-to-back years, and it all ended up happening for the 50th anniversary. So at the end of the day, there was symmetry to it, and it landed, I think, at the perfect time.
I love that. And so I guess, what was the most fun part of creating this book? You know, there's a lot of things that you got to, a lot of people you got to talk to and things you got to, read about and learn about. But I guess what was just the most fun part for you?
The most fun and coolest part was the idea that I had around the pregame and the postgame and the first and second intermissions. So when we started with the concept and the Islanders were okay with it, then kind of gave me some confidence to kind of execute this idea, which was, I knew Brendan Burke was of a similar age than me and was a young dad as well. And I wanted to pitch him the idea for the book and said, hey, instead of having a prologue, I want a pregame, and would you be willing to write it? So when he wrote that 4 years ago, I think he only had 2 kids, and now he has 3. And then I got greedy and said, well, what if we had a post game? And Jiggs McDonald, the Hall of Fame Islanders broadcaster, wrote that, and he did. And then I said, well, what if we had a first and second intermission? And then we got Stan Fischler to write the first intermission, the hockey maven, and then Chris King, the radio play-by-play voice, did the second intermission with the beautiful ode to Butch Goring. So when we were able to do that, I knew we had a success, because the credibility was just going to be there, that they lended to it. And then even small things like making sure that I had Paul Cartier, who's the organist in the book, to have Eric Hornick, who's their statistician. He stat checked the book for me to make sure I had no mistakes. I wanted this to be something that really resonated with an Islander fan, that really understood the history, the culture of the team from back then and now, because that's probably been passed on from one generation to the next. And, whether or not you were 50 or 60 and looking through these pictures, or young parents showing it to your son or daughter for the first time, they were going to get the full picture of what it meant to be an Islander fan.
Yeah, I got a glimpse of that Brandon Burke sort of prologue. And man, the one thing that really touched me that he said was, you know, there's a casual hockey fan is like a unicorn, but a casual Islanders fan doesn't exist. And I think that that is such a great little quote because it's completely true. It's really easy to sort of bandwagon onto New York sports teams. You don't really see that with the New York Islanders. So for anyone who hasn't gotten this book, I very much recommend that you do because
Me too.
it pulls at the heartstrings a little bit. And I thought Brendan did a fantastic job, as you mentioned.
He always finds the right words during the
Always.
course of a broadcast, and he did so again for this. And yeah, I mean, Islander fans, hockey fans in general, but the Islanders are very much a very community feel for a professional sports team. And I think that's different. I'm a fan of the Mets, of the Giants, of the Knicks. It's just different. This feels like a community and a family, and much more so than any other fan base that I'm a part of. And, that has, it's a unique, sometimes dysfunctional family of fanatics, as I wrote in the book, around what Isles Nation is and represents. But he did capture that, so extremely well. And I think a lot of the parents will relate to what he talks about, just trying to get your kid down before the end of the first period and, trying to put some hockey sticks in their hands and start to teach them how to pronounce the word Vezina at some point.
Yeah. I love that. Yeah. I'm not necessarily an Islanders fan myself, but that is one thing I've always admired about Islanders Nation and that whole family is that it's very much so a community. And Islanders fans are committed, if nothing else, incredibly committed. So and especially this season on that, if we want to transition a little bit to actual Islanders talk, because you're also an Islanders expert. Right now we're watching them kind of deadlocked in what is the wild card and the playoff race as we journey towards the Stanley Cup playoffs. And so they're doing a great job kind of staving off the competition right now in that Eastern Conference wild card race. And last night they played that signature third period where they come back from a 2-goal deficit against the Penguins and all of that, which is they're so commonly known for doing now at this point. This season feels like the comeback kids season in the third period for this team. I guess what differences are you seeing now versus, a two months ago, a couple months ago when they were struggling and on some serious losing slides?
Yeah, I mean, January was horrendous. They could not score 2 goals. They couldn't score a third period goal, even though that was a bit of their calling card in the early part of the season with some big comeback victories. They now have 4 comeback victories of multi-goals deficits in the third period this season. That's as many as they had the previous 7 years combined. And they've outscored now teams 17-1 in the third period over the last 10 games. Now, the thing that's so crazy about all of this is that they lost Matt Barzal, and they're now 6-1-1 without him. And JG Pageau has also been out, as has been Cal Clutterbuck. Now, they were able to acquire Bohrer, and the idea about that was to infuse offense and that they needed the goal scorer and they needed a line mate for Barzal, all of which is still very much true. But what the Islanders did so well under Barry Trotz was playing this defensive first, very structured, defensively responsible style. And then when they moved on to Lane Lambert this year, it looked like they were searching for their identity as to this hybrid model of things being a little bit more open, but still trying to rely on that elite goaltending that they get from Ilya Sorokin and their strong top 4 defensemen. But they were all over the place throughout the course of the season. And for whatever reason, the loss of Barzal and Pageau, it was like that the players looked at themselves and said, we don't have the ability to just win the way we had been playing without Barzal and Pageau. We have to pay more attention and start to focus on the things that perhaps we should have been focusing on the entire time, which is that level of detail. So they've been extremely structured in the way they're playing, and their defensive efforts have been outstanding. And Ilya Sorokin's not having to save 35, 37 shots a night, and many of them being high danger because the game is under control. And if they get the lead, they're protecting that lead. So I was someone that wrote them off. When the Barzal injury happened, I was thinking, okay, this will give them clarity to be sellers at the deadline, sell Varlamov, sell Scott Mayfield, and start to regroup for next year. And they've proven me wrong because now they are at the top wild card spot. They're starting to create a little bit of separation with some of the teams that are chasing them there. And it makes you curiously optimistic as to what this team could be like if Barzal and Pageau gets back and starts to play in the same way the rest of the team has.
Yeah, and just adding on to that, when Barzal went out, you're thinking, oh my gosh, you're seeing Josh Bailey on the first power play, and Islanders Twitter, of course, will go ballistic over that any chance they get. I do want to ask you though about, it wasn't this last game against the Penguins, but it was the previous one where it was nationally broadcast, and PK Subban was on the internet in the intermission report. I can see you smiling. You already know where I'm going with this.
Yeah.
He recently made comments on the intermission show about how the Islanders play a boring brand of hockey. Now, I would agree with that maybe under Barry Trotz, but, we've seen even, Brendan Burke and countless others across the Twitterverse firing back at him for this. I would argue that we have seen fantastic and very gritty play from the likes of Hudson Fasching and the captain Anders Lee. Even Josh Bailey's getting a couple points on his own. They've returned to this sort of heavy forecheck style of play that frustrates the heck out of opposing teams. So here's a little bit of a loaded softball question, but you can go off if you like. Do you think the Islanders play boring hockey, and why or why not?
And the thing is, I don't care if they're playing boring hockey as long as that hockey is winning hockey. And under Barry Trotz, they absolutely played boring hockey compared to a lot of other teams, but they won consistently. Right now, the Minnesota Wild are one of the more boring hockey teams in the NHL, but probably play the closest style to the New York Islanders. And they're going to be a very tough out in the playoffs this year. Now, the NHL national media relationship with the Islanders is always unique because no matter what they do, it's a bit under the radar. Occasionally they get the spotlight all to themselves where, Bohrer gets traded weeks ahead of the deadline and it's All-Star weekend and they got a lot of buzz there. But we don't think the national media actually spends a lot of time watching Islander games. It just doesn't feel that way. So there are easy pickings in that regard. Now, this kind of goes back to January where Paul Bissonnette was on the TNT broadcast, and he said that the Islanders were an absolute snoo fest, boring as hell, and that he'd rather see the team like the Buffalo Sabres be in the playoffs rather than the boring Islanders. And then Subban and Ryan Callahan, had the poked fun again with them kind of faking that the first period had put them to sleep. But it's become a bit of a rallying cry for the fan base again. Now the T-shirts have already been out there. A lot of the Yes Men outfitters and other content creators had already had the memes and the T-shirts about Islanders hockey, boring teams to death. And so that stuff is just kind of coming back now again, because it had been part of the, dialogue and the consciousness of everybody during the Barry Trotz years. But, if they continue to play that boring style of hockey for the next, 15 games or so much, I think they'll be in the playoffs. And, let's see if they can avoid Boston, and if they do, let's see whether or not they can give them or Carolina a tough first round.
Yeah, sometimes boring wins games, and that's okay, and that was very okay. But hey, it's still fun to watch hockey regardless, and we're gonna transition once more to another very fun to watch team. Talk a little bit of Fordham, because I know you went to Fordham. We were just talking about the game last night at the Barclays Center, and how incredible that was. So I guess, have you been watching the men's basketball team specifically this season, or any of the teams at Fordham? And if so, what have you seen, and how exciting is it to see the way they've showed out this year, especially in, football and basketball?
It's completely surreal. The basketball season now, Fordham's athletics is, favorited on my ESPN app. So, I'm actually following all the games. I get the alerts. I can't say whether or not I'm, tuning in, especially with little ones at home and keep you quite busy on the weekends, whether I'm tuning in from tip off to the end of the game. But without question, very early on in the year, you started to pay attention that this year could be a little bit different. And listen, from someone who's not watching the program as closely as I did, obviously, when I was in school, when Kyle Neptune leaves, you go, oh, they just said we're trying to build off of that season. And, this guy gets an opportunity he can't say no to. And what a shame, because it looked like he was really building something special. And they didn't go external. They stayed internal with Keith Ergo. And you go, okay, well, they've tried to go with bigger names in the past and it hasn't worked out, or someone that's, had been at a mid-level school and maybe did not know the New York City landscape, but had success, and that didn't work out. Let's see how this goes. And you saw the players that decided to stick around and be here because of the culture and the connection they had with the coach. And you just watched that post-game interview he had on Thursday, and you understand why he connects with his players and the fan base and the seniority, and the job Ed Cole's done at the athletic director's position as well, where, this Ramley thing is really taking off. So for me, it's completely surreal, because I was there during some of the most awful years of Fordham basketball. I mean, they've all been not very good, but look at the 2001, 2, and 3, and 4 Fordham Rams statistics, and you'll understand, where I came from, where we had the 2002 Smush Parker team, which was extremely interesting to be on those bus rides with, but weren't really a cohesive unit coached by Bob Hill. The following year, that team went 2-26. They did get a couple forfeited wins after the year from St. Bonaventure, I think. And then I was there for Derek Wittenberg's first year, which was a transitional year. So to have been someone who was at the Rose Hill Gym where you could not give away tickets or get people in there to watch and see this, where I was actually weeks ago looking at the last couple games of the year and saying, well, maybe I could sneak up there, and you know what? No tickets available. You couldn't get in. And you know what? I was upset about that, but it was awesome to see. Some of the guys I graduated with, like Mike Ratty, who called games back then, he's been coming in from Massachusetts all the time for these games this year, and then goes to Puggley's Pizza with his family afterwards, which is pretty awesome. And he was in Brooklyn yesterday. So let's see, see whether or not by the time this airs, whether or not they'll be on their way to another victory. And if they're playing for a chance to be in the tournament, I mean, that's going to be something that anyone that's kind of touched this program over the last 25, 30 years is probably going to want to be at.
All right. I'd like to extend a huge thank you to Joe Buono. If you love the Islanders and you're tired of getting spammed by Steven Rossner, I'm just kidding, at JBUONONYI is your go-to, as well as his newsletter, Isles Fix, and go buy his book on Book Baby. I cannot recommend it enough. New York Islanders A to Z. Joe, thank you so much, and we will return to One-on-One, New York's longest running sports call-in show.